I was 19 years old the night my mother ripped my MIT acceptance letter into pieces so small they looked like confetti on our kitchen floor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with that flat, certain expression she'd worn my entire life and said, "This was never going to happen anyway." 6 years later, I sat across from a university financial aid officer and signed paperwork that guaranteed my niece a full ride to any college she chose. My mother found out at Easter dinner. In front of everyone. And she had absolutely nothing left to say. My name is Lyra Castellan. I grew up on Mechanic Street in Cumberland, Maryland, in a gray-sided duplex with a landlord who painted over the mold instead of fixing it and a front porch that tilted 3 degrees to the left. Cumberland sits at the elbow of the Potomac River in the western tip of Maryland, boxed in by mountains on every side. It's the kind of town that had its golden era sometime around 1950 and never quite recovered from knowing it. The railroad came through once. The factories came through once. The money came through once. By the time I was growing up there, most of what was left were the buildings those things had abandoned. My father, Roy Castellan, drove a delivery truck for a regional beverage distributor 5 days a week and coached youth baseball on Saturdays because he didn't know what else to do with himself when he wasn't moving. My mother, Francine Castellan, worked the register at a pharmacy on Baltimore Street for 11 years. The same pharmacy, the same register, the same route from the parking lot to the back break room every single day. She was not an unhappy woman. That's the part one want to be precise about because it matters later. She was not miserable. She was settled. There is a difference, and for a long time I confused the two. I had a younger sister named Becca who was 14 when I was 19. Becca had our mother's eyes and our father's stubbornness and a laugh that made strangers at grocery stores turn around and smile. She was the kind of kid who made you believe that some people are just built lucky. I loved her in the uncomplicated way you love someone who has never once disappointed you, which is a rare thing in any family. Before we go any further, I want to say something directly to anyone watching this right now who grew up in a house where ambition was treated like a character flaw. Where wanting more was reframed as ingratitude. Where leaving was considered a betrayal of the people who stayed. This channel exists for you. If that sentence just landed somewhere real in your chest, hit subscribe because every story here is built around that exact feeling and what one woman decided to do with it. Now let me tell you what happened. The rule in our house was never written down. Didn't need to be. It operated the way most effective rules operate, through repetition and example, until it stopped feeling like a rule at all and started feeling like weather. The rule was simple. You don't reach past what this family can hold. You finish high school. You get a local job or a local certificate. You stay inside the county line in some meaningful way, whether that means geography or expectation or both. My mother had done it. Her sister Paulette had done it. My grandmother on my mother's side had done it so completely that she'd never once held a passport in her 78 years of living. This was not presented as a tragedy. It was presented as loyalty. I understood the rule by the time I was 12. I started breaking it quietly at 14. The public library on Green Street had a back corner on the second floor with 2 desktop computers and a study corral wedged between the large print fiction section and a shelf of outdated atlases. That corral was mine every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon from 3:30 to 5:45. I told my mother I had a study group. The study group was me, alone, reading every college admissions guide the library owned, printing fee waiver forms on the library printer for 20 cents a page, and building a spreadsheet on a flash drive I kept hidden inside the lining of my winter coat. I took the SAT twice. The first time as a junior I scored 1490. I told no one. The second time in the fall of my senior year, I scored 1540. I told no one. I applied to 9 schools on full fee waivers. One of them was MIT. I wrote my application essay about the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal that runs through Cumberland, about how a thing built to carry goods from one place to another had become a historical relic that people jogged past without thinking about where it had ever meant to go. I did not understand until I was submitting the application that I had written the essay about myself. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in April. I saw it in the mailbox before my mother got home from her shift, which ended at 4. It was 12 minutes past 3. The envelope was thick. Everyone who has ever waited for a college letter knows what thick means. I took it inside. I went to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub with the door locked and opened it with my thumbnail because we didn't have a letter opener and I was not about to wait another second. The first line said congratulations. The second paragraph contained the words full need-based financial aid package. The third page had a breakdown. Tuition, housing, meal plan, a small stipend for books and incidentals. The total out-of-pocket cost to my family was listed at the bottom of the third page. It was 0. I read that number 4 times. I sat on the edge of that tub for 22 minutes. Then I folded the letter, put it in the inside pocket of my hoodie, and went downstairs to start dinner before my mother got home. I had a plan. The plan was to tell her calmly, with the financial breakdown already highlighted, with every question she might ask already answered in order on a note card I had prepared in the library 2 weeks earlier, because I had believed, genuinely believed, that the only reason my mother would say no was fear of cost. I believed that if I removed the financial obstacle, the conversation would be different. That was my first real miscalculation about who my mother was. She came home at 4:12. I had the note card in my pocket. I had the letter in my hoodie. I had pasta on the stove and the financial aid breakdown highlighted in yellow on the kitchen table because I thought presentation mattered. I told her the moment she set down her purse. I said, "Mom, I got into MIT. Full ride. 0 cost to us." I put the letter on the table. I put the highlighted breakdown beside it. Francine Castellan looked at the letter for a long moment. She did not pick it up immediately. She read it where it lay, the way you read a menu at a restaurant you didn't choose. Then she picked it up. She read it again slowly, this time all 3 pages. I watched her face for the reaction I had prepared for, fear or shock, or even a complicated pride she didn't know how to express. What I got instead was something I had no note card for. She set the letter down. She picked it up again. And then, without raising her voice, without any visible anger, she tore it. Not quickly, not in a rage. Slowly, deliberately, the way you tear something you want to make sure stays torn. She tore it lengthwise first, then crosswise, then again, until the pieces were too small to tear further. They fell across my highlighted breakdown like the whole thing was a joke she'd just finished delivering. She looked at me and said, "This was never going to happen anyway." Then she turned back to the stove and asked if I had salted the pasta water. Becca was in the doorway. I don't know how long she'd been standing there. She was holding her backpack by one strap with both hands, the way kids hold things when they don't know whether to stay or go. She was 14 years old and she was watching our mother destroy something that had taken me 4 years to build in secret. She did not say anything. She looked at me. I looked at her. Then she went upstairs and I stood in the kitchen with the pieces of my acceptance letter scattered across the table, and I did not cry and I did not argue and I did not say a single word, because I had just understood something about my mother that no note card could have prepared me for. She wasn't afraid of the cost. She was afraid of what my leaving would mean about the life she had chosen to stay for. That night, after my father came home and ate dinner and watched the news and went to bed without knowing any of it had happened, I went back downstairs at 1 in the morning. The pieces of the letter were still on the table. My mother had not thrown them away. She had left them there, which told me something. I gathered every piece. I took them to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the tile floor with the pieces spread across my knees like a puzzle. We kept a roll of clear tape in the medicine cabinet. I used almost the entire roll. I taped every seam, every tear, every fragmented edge, until the letter was whole again, wrinkled and cross-hatched with tape lines but completely, stubbornly legible. The scholarship sentence ran across 3 tape lines. I could still read every word. I folded it in quarters. I put it in the inside pocket of my winter coat against the flash drive against my chest. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. By morning, I had already decided that the letter being taped back together was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the only version of it that was ever going to matter. I left Cumberland on a Thursday morning in late August with a duffel bag, a taped letter, and $214 in cash I had saved over 8 months from babysitting the Delgado kids 3 houses down and picking up Saturday shifts at the Dollar Tree on Virginia Avenue. My father knew I was leaving. My mother did not come out of the bedroom to say goodbye. That was its own kind of answer. The bus out of Cumberland left at 6:40 in the morning from a depot on Industrial Boulevard that smelled like diesel and old coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who had been waiting too long for things that kept being delayed. I had a paper ticket to Baltimore and from Baltimore a second ticket to Boston. The total fare was $93. I had printed the schedule at the library 3 weeks earlier on the same printer I had used for my college fee waivers, same 20 cents a page, same librarian at the desk who had never once asked me what I was printing or why. My father walked me to the end of the block. Not to the depot, just to the corner of Mechanic Street and the Cross Street, which was as far as he went without it becoming a thing. He was wearing his work clothes because his route started at 7:30. He carried my duffel to the corner and set it down. He looked at me the way he looked at a route map when the roads didn't connect the way he needed them to. Like the problem was real, but the solving of it was somewhere just past what he could currently see. He took his wallet out. He counted out $60 in tens and fives and held them out without looking at me directly. I took the money. He picked up the duffel and handed it to me. He said, "You call when you get there." I said I would. He turned around and walked back toward the house. I watched him go until he turned the corner. Then I picked up the duffel and walked to the depot alone. Becca had slipped a note under my door the night before. It was written on a piece of lined paper torn from a spiral notebook, the kind with the fringe still on the left edge. The note was 4 sentences. She said she was sorry she hadn't said anything in the kitchen. She said she knew it wasn't enough. She said she had written down my dorm address from the MIT housing letter she had found in my coat pocket 2 weeks earlier, because she had been looking for a pen. She said she would write first. I folded the note and put it in the duffel. I did not write back before I left because I did not know yet what to say that wouldn't make leaving harder than it already was. Boston arrived at 6:14 in the evening. South Station was loud and enormous and smelled like pretzels and something underneath pretzels that I could not name. I had a printed map of the T from the library and a housing confirmation letter from MIT's Residential Services office telling me my move-in date was August 26th, which was the next day. I had arrived a day early because I had miscounted on the calendar, which was the kind of mistake I never made and which told me something about the state I had been in for the previous 3 weeks. I found a bench in the station and sat on it with my duffel between my feet and ate the peanut butter sandwich I had wrapped in a paper towel that morning before anyone else in the house was awake. I sat there for 2 hours. Then I found the T-stop and took the red line to Kendall Square and walked the remaining 6 blocks to campus with the duffel on my shoulder and the taped letter in my coat pocket and the specific, hollow, terrifying feeling of having done the thing you planned for so long that the planning had become more real than the thing itself. The first year at MIT was the hardest year of my life and also the best, and I am aware that those 2 facts sound contradictory until you understand that sometimes the hardest thing and the best thing are the same event experienced at 2 different speeds. I was studying biomedical engineering. I had placed into second-year calculus based on my entrance scores, which meant my first semester coursework was designed for people who had spent their summers doing math for fun. And I had spent my summer trying not to fall apart in a house where my mother had stopped speaking to me directly and routed all communication through my father or the kitchen wall. I had some catching up to do. I did it. I averaged 4.5 hours of sleep per night from September through December and came out of finals week with a 3.71 GPA, which my academic advisor, a compact and precise woman named Dr. Ingrid Holst, described as remarkable given my course load. I described it as what happens when the alternative to studying is thinking about home. I emailed my mother once in October. A short email, just my dorm address and my campus phone extension and a sentence that said I was doing well and hoped she was too. She did not reply. I did not email again. I did not call. I kept the taped letter in the top drawer of my desk, face up, where I could see it from the bed. The tape had started to yellow slightly at the edges. The letter was still completely legible. I read the scholarship line every morning before I got up, not for inspiration, which sounds like something you'd put on a poster, but for orientation. It reminded me where I was and how I had gotten there and what it had cost to tape it back together in the first place. Becca wrote first the way she said she would. Her first letter arrived in November, 3 weeks after midterms. It was 2 pages front and back in the looping cursive she had developed in 6th grade and never abandoned. She told me that Francine had rearranged the living room furniture 2 weeks after I left and repainted my bedroom a pale green she described as the color of a hospital waiting room. She told me our father had taken on an extra delivery route on Wednesdays and was coming home later. She told me she had joined the school newspaper and had written a piece about the canal path that her English teacher had called the best student journalism she had read in 11 years of teaching. I read that line twice. I wrote back the same evening 4 pages, which was the most I had written by hand since my college application essay. I told her about Dr. Holst. I told her about the lab. I told her about the particular silence of a Boston winter that was different from the silence of Cumberland in a way I was still trying to identify. I told her she was a better writer than she knew. I mailed it the next morning from the campus post office on Ames Street. We wrote back and forth for the rest of that first year. Not emails. Letters. Becca had decided that emails were too fast, that they made you say less because you could always send another one, and that letters made you mean what you wrote because the postage cost something. She was 15 and she had already figured out something it takes most people decades to learn. I saved every letter in a shoebox on the top shelf of my dorm closet. By the end of freshman year there were 11 of them. By the end of sophomore year there were 23. What Becca did not tell me in any of those letters, and what I did not learn until much later, was what was happening to her at home in the space my leaving had created. I had assumed, with the particular blind confidence of someone who has just escaped a thing, that my leaving would have no structural consequence for anyone still inside it. I had assumed that the pressure in that house would simply equalize and that Becca, who was younger and softer and more naturally agreeable than I had ever been, would navigate it without difficulty. That assumption was wrong in almost every specific way an assumption can be wrong, and by the time I understood how wrong it was, the consequences had already been running for 2 years without me. What I found out came in a phone call I was not expecting on a Tuesday in October of my junior year. I was in the materials lab on the 3rd floor of Building 16 running a tensile test on a polymer composite sample at 11:15 in the morning when my cell phone vibrated on the bench beside me. The number was a Cumberland area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped me. I picked up. The voice on the other end was not my father's and it was not Becca's. It was my Aunt Paulette, my mother's younger sister, who had never in my memory called me directly for anything, and whose voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, which was urgency without anger, the sound of someone delivering information they did not want to be the one to deliver. She said, "Lyra, your mother has been telling people at the church that you dropped out." I stood very still next to the polymer composite sample. I said, "I'm sorry." Paulette said, "She told Sister Agnes at the women's group last month. She told the Delaney family at the fall social 2 weeks ago. She told your father's co-worker's wife at the depot picnic in September." I let that settle. 3 separate occasions. 3 separate audiences. A constructed, distributed story that I had washed out of MIT and come back quietly and was now working somewhere unspecified, doing something unspecified, having learned my lesson about reaching too far. Paulette said, "I thought you should know." I thanked her. I hung up. I stood next to the tensile tester for 4 minutes without moving. Then I wrote the test results in my lab notebook in the same handwriting I always used and finished the session and walked back to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table until dark, working out what a woman tells herself to make that kind of story feel necessary. I did not confront my mother about the dropped-out story. That is the part people always find surprising when I tell it, the restraint, the silence, the fact that I sat with that information for weeks without doing anything visible with it. But I had learned something in that first year away from Cumberland that I had not expected to learn, which was that reaction is expensive and I had a limited budget. Every hour I spent constructing a response to something my mother had done was an hour pulled from the lab, from the coursework, from the slow and unglamorous work of becoming someone she would eventually have no language left to diminish. I filed the dropped-out story in the same mental folder where I kept the torn letter and the taped seams and the pale green paint on my bedroom wall. The folder was getting thick. I left it closed. Junior year was the year the work stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like direction. Dr. Holst had connected me with a research team in MIT's biomedical devices lab that was developing a low-cost diagnostic sensor for use in rural and underserved clinical settings. The concept was elegant in the way only genuinely useful things are elegant. A small, portable device that could detect specific protein markers in a blood sample in under 40 minutes without refrigeration or specialized training. The kind of tool that mattered in places where the nearest hospital was an hour away and the nearest specialist was a referral and a 3-month wait. I understood that problem from the inside in a way that had nothing to do with a textbook. I had grown up in a place where people drove 40 minutes to Hagerstown for things that should have been available locally. I joined the team in January of junior year. I was the youngest researcher on it by 4 years. The lab work restructured my days in a way that was clarifying rather than consuming. I was in the lab by 7 most mornings, gone by 9 most evenings, with a middle block carved out for classes and the dining hall job I had kept since freshman year, Wednesday and Friday lunch service, which paid $11 an hour and kept my meal costs down to almost nothing. My apartment at that point was a 1-bedroom on Albany Street that I shared with a doctoral candidate named Priya Anand, who was 6 years into a PhD in computational biology and had the particular quality of focused calm that people develop when they have been working on a single hard problem long enough to stop being afraid of it. Priya was from Chennai originally. She had left her family at 22 for a master's program in Edinburgh and from there to MIT. And she understood without needing to be told the specific texture of building a life in a place that had no memory of you. We did not talk about our families often. When we did, it was in the shorthand of people who have already done the explaining and reached the part where the explaining is no longer the point. It was Priya who noticed the letter. It was February of junior year, a Tuesday, and I had taken it out of the desk drawer to retape a corner that had started lifting. I had the letter flat on the kitchen counter with a fresh strip of tape across the upper left edge when Priya came in from the lab. She set her bag down. She looked at the letter. She looked at the tape dispenser. She said, "How many times have you taped that?" I said, "Just the once. I'm just maintaining it." She picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something that has clearly already survived something, and she read it. Not the whole thing, just the top section, the congratulations, the scholarship line. She set it down. She said, "Your mother did this?" I said yes. She nodded once, the way Priya nodded when she had processed something and filed it and was moving forward. She said, "Frame it." I told her I didn't have a frame. She said, "I have a frame." She went to her room and came back with a plain black document frame, 8 by 10, the kind that comes in a 3-pack from the campus bookstore. He handed it to me. I put the letter in it that night. I hung it above the desk on a nail that was already in the wall from the previous tenant. Priya made tea. Neither of us said anything else about it. The frame stayed on that wall for the remaining year and a half I lived in that apartment, and every morning when I sat down at the desk I looked at it, and every time I looked at it I thought about the tape and not about the tearing, which I believe was the correct order of emphasis. Becca's letters through junior year were different from the ones before. Sophomore year her letters had been newsy, school updates and neighborhood gossip and small observations about Cumberland that were funny in the precise way that things are funny when the person writing them is talented and doesn't yet know it. Junior year the tone shifted. The letters were shorter. The details were more carefully selected, which meant she was leaving things out, and Becca had never been the kind of person who left things out because she was cautious. She left things out when she was protecting someone. I noticed it in October. By December I was certain of it. I wrote and asked her directly, "What are you not telling me?" She did not answer the question in her next letter. She answered it in the one after that, in January of my senior year, and when I read what she had written I sat at the desk under the framed letter for a long time without moving. What she told me was this. Our mother had, over the course of the previous year, begun what Becca described as the project, which was her name for the slow and systematic work of redirecting Becca's future toward something manageable and local and completely within the county line. It had started subtly, the way these things always start. A comment about how community college was more practical than people gave it credit for. A mention that the pharmacy on Baltimore Street was hiring front-of-house staff and that a job like that had good stability. A suggestion that Becca's boyfriend, a decent and gentle boy named Marcus who worked at the AutoZone on Green Street, was exactly the kind of steady person a girl should hold on to. None of it was a command. All of it was a current, and Becca was 17 and living in that house, and the current was moving her somewhere she had not chosen to go, and she could feel it but could not yet name it clearly enough to push back against it. She was not being threatened. She was being arranged, which is a different and in some ways more effective operation, because you can argue with a threat but you cannot argue with a series of gentle suggestions that have not yet assembled themselves into a pattern you can point to. I read the letter twice. I wrote back the same day. I told her I saw the pattern. I named it in plain language so she could see it named. I told her that what was being built around her had been built around me and had been built around our mother before either of us was born, and that the people doing the building did not experience themselves as builders. They experienced themselves as people who loved her and wanted her safe, which was true and beside the point simultaneously. I told her that the fact that it came from love did not mean she had to accept it as her destination. I told her that I was going to finish my degree in May. I told her I had something I was working on that I would tell her about when it was finished. I told her to keep writing, keep working, keep being the person her English teacher had called the best student journalist she'd read in 11 years. I told her that her talent was not a coincidence and it was not going to disappear just because someone in her immediate environment had decided not to notice it. What I did not tell her in that letter, because it was not yet real enough to write down, was that I had been in a meeting 3 weeks earlier with Dr. Holst and 2 representatives from a Boston-based medical technology firm called Veritas Diagnostics that had expressed interest in licensing the sensor technology our lab had developed. The meeting had lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, one of the Veritas representatives, a quiet and direct woman named Carol Fenn, had asked me specifically about the rural deployment application I had written into our last grant report, the section where I had described the clinical need from a first-person geographic perspective. She said it was the most compelling needs analysis she had read in a licensing proposal in 4 years of doing this work. I had written it about Cumberland without naming Cumberland. I had written it about my mother's co-workers and my father's delivery routes and the 40-minute drive to Hagerstown and every person I had grown up watching manage their health around the absence of options rather than the presence of them. Carol Fenn had read it and called it compelling. I thanked her and walked out of the meeting and stood in the hallway of the Stata Center for approximately 90 seconds processing the particular feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to see you at all. The licensing agreement with Veritas was signed 14 months later. I was 1 month out of my MIT undergraduate degree and 3 weeks into the first semester of my doctoral program in the same lab under Dr. Holst. My founder's share in the licensing arrangement was a structured royalty agreement with an upfront payment and a percentage of net revenue from each unit deployed in clinical settings. The upfront payment landed in my account on a Tuesday morning in October. I looked at the number for a long time. Then I opened a new document on my laptop and started making a list, the same way I made any list in the lab. Numbered, specific, and pointed directly at the problem I intended to solve. The list had 7 items. The first item was Becca's situation, specifically what she needed that she was not going to get from inside that house on Mechanic Street without external intervention. The second item was timing because Becca was 17, which meant I had less than a year before the current my mother had been running would deliver her somewhere she had not chosen and might not be able to leave cleanly. The third item was mechanism, which was the legal and financial structure I would need to build in order to make what I was planning real rather than rhetorical. The fourth item was the reveal because I had learned from watching my mother operate that the most durable form of communication is not the argument, which can be denied and reframed and outlasted, but the fait accompli, the thing that is already done and sitting on the table before anyone has a chance to object to the doing of it. The fifth item was the audience because I had also learned that certain kinds of accountability require witnesses. The sixth item was what I would not do, which was argue, justify, or apologize for any part of it. The seventh item was what I would do if it went wrong, which was leave anyway the same way I had left the first time, with the thing that mattered in my coat pocket and the door closing quietly behind me. I called an estate and trust attorney named Dennis Hara, whose name I had gotten from Priya's labmate, a second-year doctoral student named Felix who had used him for a small business incorporation. Dennis Hara had an office on Tremont Street in downtown Boston, 15th floor, a view of the common from the east-facing window. He charged $340 an hour. I went on a Wednesday at noon and brought a legal pad. I told him what I wanted. A scholarship trust funded by a portion of my Veritas upfront payment. The beneficiary would be my sister Rebecca Ann Castellan, currently 17 years old, resident of Cumberland, Maryland. The trust would activate upon her acceptance to any accredited 2-year college, 4-year university, or certified vocational program in the United States. The funding amount I had in mind was $220,000, enough to cover 4 years at a state school with room and board and a modest living stipend, or 2 years at a private institution with supplemental aid. I told Dennis I wanted the structure to be ironclad, not advisory. I wanted the money to be hers upon acceptance and enrollment, with no cosigner requirement and no parental consent clause, because Becca would be 18 by the time she applied and the trust needed to function independently of whatever opinion existed in that house on Mechanic Street about whether she should be going anywhere at all. Dennis asked the right questions in the right order, which is how I knew he was worth $340 an hour. He asked whether I anticipated legal challenge from any family member. I said it was possible. He asked whether the beneficiary was aware of the trust. I said not yet. He asked whether I wanted a disclosure provision that would notify the beneficiary upon execution. I said no. I wanted her to know about it when I told her in person in a context I had chosen. He accepted that without comment and drafted the instrument over the following 9 days. We met twice more to review language. The trust was executed and funded on a Friday afternoon in November, 31 days after I had first opened the document on my laptop and started the list. Dennis handed me the signed paperwork in a manila envelope with his firm's name embossed in the upper left corner. He shook my hand. He said, "This is a generous thing." I said it was a corrective thing. He smiled at that in a way that suggested he had heard the distinction before. I did not tell Becca about the trust in a letter. I had been sending her letters for 3 years and I knew exactly what she would do with that information in a letter, which was sit with it alone in her room in that house, with our mother 2 floors below, and feel the weight of it without anyone beside her to help carry it. I needed to tell her in person, which meant I needed a reason to be in Cumberland that my mother would not be able to preemptively close off. The reason presented itself 6 weeks later in the form of our parents' 25th wedding anniversary, which fell on a Saturday in January and which Aunt Paulette, who handled all family logistics with the efficiency of someone who had decided that if she didn't do it, it would not be done, had organized into a dinner at the Fairfield Inn on Willowbrook Road with 12 family members and a sheet cake from the Giant on Virginia Avenue. Paulette called me herself. She was the only person in Cumberland who had my current phone number other than Becca. She said, "I don't know if you're coming and I'm not telling you that you have to, but I'm telling you that your parents are going to be in a room with your sister and a sheet cake on Saturday the 14th and I thought you should know that." I said I would be there. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother doesn't know I called you." I said I understood. She said, "Just so you know." I said I did. We hung up. I booked a flight from Logan to Hagerstown Regional Airport, the small airport 30 miles south of Cumberland that had 2 gates and a coffee machine that required exact change. I rented a gray Nissan Altima at the counter. I drove north on Route 40 through a January afternoon the color of old pewter, past the bare ridgeline of Dawn Mountain, past the Route 36 interchange into Cumberland on Williamsport Road, past the Dollar Tree where I had worked Saturday shifts 6 years earlier, past the library on Green Street where the study corral between the large print fiction and the outdated atlases was almost certainly still there and almost certainly still empty on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I parked on Mechanic Street at 4:17 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the dinner. I sat in the Nissan with the heat on and watched the duplex. The front porch still tilted 3 degrees to the left. Someone had planted a small boxwood shrub beside the bottom porch step that had not been there when I left. The mailbox had been replaced with a newer model, black metal post, silver box, the flag still red. The kitchen light was on. I could see my mother's silhouette moving past the window. She was doing what she did at 4:17 on a Saturday in January, which was what she did at 4:17 on any day in any month, which was preparing something, organizing something, moving through the rooms of that house with the particular efficiency of a person who has arranged their life so that nothing in it surprises them. I had not told my mother I was coming. I had considered it and decided against it for the same reason I had decided not to send Becca the trust information in a letter. Some information lands differently when it arrives without warning, not because surprise is a tactic, but because some things need to be seen before they can be argued with. If I called ahead, my mother would spend 2 weeks building a response. I did not want her response. I wanted her presence, which was different, and I was willing to let the distinction be uncomfortable. Becca texted me at 4:42. The text said, "I saw the gray car. I know that's you." I texted back, "Come outside for 5 minutes." She came out at 4:48 in a winter coat over what looked like a party dress, which meant she had already been getting ready for the dinner. She was 20 years old now and she looked like herself and also like someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that it had changed her posture slightly, the particular compression of a person who is managing more than their age should require. She got in the passenger side. She smelled like the same drugstore shampoo we had both used growing up. I handed her the manila envelope. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Open it." She read it slowly. She was a careful reader, always had been, the kind of person who reads a document like it might change its meaning if she moves too fast through it. She read the first page. She turned to the second. She read the section that described the funding amount and the activation conditions. She turned to the third page and read the beneficiary designation, her full name, Rebecca and Castellan, in the clean formal typeface of a legal instrument. She set the papers on her knee. She looked out through the windshield at the duplex. The kitchen light was still on. Our mother's silhouette was still moving past the window. Becca said, "She doesn't know." I said, "No." She said, "When did you do this?" I said, November. She turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes were the same as they had always been, our mother's eyes, which I had always thought was an irony so complete it was almost architectural. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed it to be real before it was a conversation." She looked back at the papers. She said, "It's real." I said, "It's real." She folded the papers carefully back into the envelope. She held the envelope against her chest with both hands the way she had held her backpack in the kitchen doorway 6 years ago, the night our mother tore the letter. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. We sat in the gray Nissan on Mechanic Street for 11 minutes without talking, with the heat running and the kitchen light on and our mother's silhouette moving back and forth behind the window, unaware that the variable she had spent 2 years carefully arranging had just been permanently changed. The Fairfield Inn on Willowbrook Road had a private dining room off the main lobby that seated 16 and smelled like carpet cleaner and the particular brand of floral air freshener that hotels in mid-sized American cities had been using since approximately 1994. Aunt Paulette had arranged a long rectangular table with a white cloth, a centerpiece of artificial cream roses in a glass vase, and printed place cards in a font she had clearly spent some time selecting. My parents' names were at the head and foot. The sheet cake from the Giant was on a side table, white frosting, blue script, Roy and Francine 25 years. There were 12 people in the room when I walked in at 6:03. 13 once the door closed behind me. My mother was standing near the window talking to my father's younger brother, Uncle Gerald, and his wife. She had her back to the door. My father saw me first. He was holding a glass of iced tea near the side table and he went very still when the door opened, the way he went still when he was computing something he had not been given enough time to prepare for. He did not smile immediately. He nodded first, a single slow nod, and then something in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same family as one crossed his expression, and he lifted his iced tea glass a fraction of an inch in my direction. That was Roy Castellan's version of a standing ovation and I received it as such. Paulette saw me next. She was across the room refilling a water glass and she looked up and her expression did what Paulette's expressions always did, which was communicate 17 pieces of information in the span of about 2 seconds before settling into something publicly neutral. The 17 pieces included: she was glad I had come, she was nervous about what was going to happen, she had not told my mother, she did not regret not telling her, and she was going to let this play out without interference. She set the water pitcher down and gave me a small nod and went back to a conversation near the centerpiece. Becca was at the far end of the table. She was watching me with the focused stillness of someone who had known this was coming and had spent the drive over from Mechanic Street deciding how to hold her face. She had the manila envelope in her bag. I had told her in the car to keep it there until I needed it and that if I needed it she would know when. She gave me one small nod that meant she remembered. I nodded back. My mother turned around at 6:07. I was standing 4 feet from her when she did. The room had not gone quiet because nobody else in the room knew to make it go quiet. The conversation around us continued at its normal volume. She looked at me the way she had looked at my MIT letter 6 years ago, the reading a menu at a restaurant didn't choose look. The look that was not surprise so much as the decision about how to process an input that had not been part of the plan. She said, "Paulette called you." It was not a question. I said, "She did." My mother looked at Paulette across the room. Paulette was examining the artificial roses. My mother looked back at me. She said, "You could have told me you were coming." I said, "I wasn't sure you'd want me here." She said, "This is your father's anniversary." I said, "I know." She held my gaze for 4 seconds and then she said, "Sit down. Dinner is at 6:30. She turned and went back to the conversation with Uncle Gerald's wife. That was the entirety of our reunion after 6 years. 34 words. I sat down. Dinner was pot roast and green beans and dinner rolls from a basket. My father sat at the head of the table and said very little, which was his normal volume. Uncle Gerald told a long story about a fishing trip that may or may not have had a point. My father's coworker from the depot, a man named Stitch who had been at every family event I could remember, asked me what I was doing in Boston and I told him I was a doctoral researcher in biomedical engineering and he said, "Well, that's something," with the genuine and uncomplicated admiration of someone who did not have a complicated relationship with the information. My mother, 3 seats to my left, heard it. She did not look up from her pot roast. After dinner, Paulette brought out the sheet cake and my father's coworker's wife took a photograph of my parents standing behind it with a digital camera. The blue script said Roy and Francine 25 years. My father put his arm around my mother's shoulders for the photograph. My mother smiled for the photograph. It was a real smile, not a performance, and it landed somewhere complicated in me because the truth about my mother was never that she was a person without warmth. She was a person whose warmth had a boundary drawn around it by a set of rules she had never questioned, and everything inside the boundary she loved genuinely and completely, and I had stepped outside the boundary and that was where the complication lived. Paulette cut the cake. Gerald made a toast. The room was at that particular stage of a family dinner where the formality has dissolved and people are moving between conversations and the volume has come up and nobody is paying close attention to any single thing. That was when I stood up. I did not tap a glass. I did not raise my voice. I said, clearly enough to be heard at the table but not loudly enough to feel like a performance, I want to say something before we go. The room came down. 12 faces. My mother's was the 13th and hers was the only one that went still in the particular way that means a person has already started calculating. I looked at Becca. She reached into her bag. She took out the manila envelope and held it flat on the table in front of her without opening it. I said, 6 years ago I left this house with a taped letter in my coat pocket and $214 and a bus ticket to Baltimore. Some of you know that. Some of you were told a different version. I looked at my mother when I said the last sentence. She did not look away. I gave her credit for that. I said, I am not here to argue about the version. I am here because my sister is 20 years old and she is the best writer in this family and she has been sitting in a current that is trying to carry her somewhere she did not choose, and I am not going to watch that happen without doing something about it. My mother said, Lyra. Her voice was level. It had the quality of a warning that has not yet committed to being a warning. I said, I'm not done. She closed her mouth. I looked at Becca again. Becca stood up. She opened the manila envelope. She took out the trust document and set it on the table where it was visible. I said, that is a fully funded education trust in Becca's name. $220,000, executed in November, currently held by a Boston attorney named Dennis Hara. It activates the moment she receives an acceptance letter from any accredited school in the country. No signatures required from anyone in this room. It is already done. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the information in them has just reorganized itself into something nobody was prepared for. Uncle Gerald looked at the document. Stitch looked at his cake plate. Paulette looked at her hands. My father looked at the centerpiece. My mother looked at me. She said, you did this without telling me. I said, yes. She said, she is my daughter. I said, she is also her own. My mother's left hand was flat on the tablecloth. Her right hand was holding a dessert fork she was no longer using. She said, you walked back in here after 6 years and you did this in front of everyone. I said, I did it in November. I'm telling you now. In front of everyone. She said, why here? Why like this? I said, because some things need witnesses. That was the sentence that landed. I could see it land. Not in her face, which stayed composed in the way Francine Castellan's face stayed composed through things that would have broken the composure of most people, but in her hand, the one that was flat on the tablecloth, which pressed down very slightly, the way a hand presses down when the body underneath it is absorbing something it had not braced for. He looked at Becca. Becca was standing with the trust document in both hands, not defiantly, not triumphantly, just holding it the way you hold something that has just changed what is possible for you. My mother looked at Becca for a long time. Becca did not look away. She had our mother's eyes and she was using them in a way our mother had not anticipated. My mother set the dessert fork down. She looked back at me. She said, this was never your decision to make. I said, the letter wasn't yours to tear. 12 people in that room heard both sentences. Nobody moved. My father at the head of the table had both hands around his iced tea glass and he was looking at the centerpiece with the focused attention of a man who has understood that some things are happening in a register he cannot enter and has decided that the most useful thing he can do is stay very still and not make it worse. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I said, Happy anniversary, Dad. He looked up. He nodded, the same single nod from the beginning of the evening, slower this time, weighted differently. I looked at Becca one more time. She was still holding the document. She gave me the smallest possible nod, the kind that means I've got it from here. I walked out of the Fairfield Inn at 8:41 in the evening into a January night that was 12 degrees and absolutely still, the kind of cold that does not move around you but simply exists where you are and waits. The parking lot was lit by 2 overhead lamps that turned everything a flat yellow. My breath came out in a steady visible stream. I sat in the gray Nissan for 6 minutes with the heat off, not because I was composing myself, I was composed, but because I wanted to feel the cold for a minute before I drove back through it. The dinner had lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. The part that mattered had lasted approximately 4 minutes. Becca texted me at 9:04. She was still inside. The text said, "She went to the bathroom after you left and didn't come out for 11 minutes. My father ate the rest of his cake." I texted back, "Are you okay?" She replied immediately, "I'm better than okay." I put the phone in the cup holder and drove back toward the center of Cumberland in the particular silence of someone who has done the thing they planned and is now in the aftermath of it, which is always quieter than the planning and always feels different from what you expected, not worse, not better, just more ordinary. The way the most significant moments of your life feel ordinary from the inside while they are happening and only acquire their full weight later. I flew back to Boston the next morning from Hagerstown Regional, the same 2 gates and the same coffee machine requiring exact change. I had 75 cents and the machine wanted 80. I sat in the single row of chairs at the gate and thought about my mother in the hotel bathroom for 11 minutes. I did not think she was crying. Francine Castellan was not a person who cried in hotel bathrooms at family dinners. I thought she was standing at the sink looking at herself in the mirror the way people do when something has just reordered the information they had about their own life and they need a moment with the new version of it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Becca called me on a Sunday afternoon. Not a text, a phone call, which meant she had something to say that required the real-time feedback of hearing how I received it. She said, "Mom asked me about the trust." I said, "What did she ask?" Becca said, "She asked if I was going to use it." I said, "What did you say?" Becca said, "I said I didn't know yet." She paused. "That's not the whole truth." I said, "What's the whole truth?" She said, "I've been looking at journalism programs. There's one at the University of Maryland. There's one at Syracuse. There's one at Northwestern." I held the phone. I said, "What did your English teacher say, the one who called you the best student journalist she'd read in 11 years? Becca was quiet for a moment. Then she said Northwestern. I said, "Then you already know." Another pause. She said, "It's a lot of money even with the trust." I said, "The trust covers it." She said, "Lyra." I said, "Becca." She said, "Okay." It was the shortest conversation we had ever had about the most important thing. The application went in on a Tuesday in February, submitted from the library on Green Street at the same second-floor computer station where I had printed fee waivers 6 years earlier. Becca told me she chose the library on purpose. She said she wanted to submit it from somewhere that already had a history of that kind of decision. I told her that was exactly the right instinct. He said she knew. The acceptance came in March. Becca called me the moment she read it and I could hear in her voice the specific combination of disbelief and recognition that I remembered from my own bathroom floor with my own letter. The feeling of having prepared so carefully for a yes that when the yes actually arrived it felt both inevitable and impossible at once. She had been admitted to the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University with a partial merit scholarship. The trust covered the remainder in full. She was going to Evanston, Illinois in August. She was 20 years old and she was going to Northwestern and there was nothing in the world that required anyone's permission. She told our mother that evening. I was not there for that conversation. Becca called me afterward at 11:15 at night and I could tell from the texture of her voice that it had been hard and also that she was intact on the other side of it. She said our mother had listened without interrupting, which was not what either of us had expected. She said our mother had asked one question when Becca finished, which was, "Did Lyra know before tonight?" Becca said yes. Our mother had nodded. She had gone into the kitchen. She had come back with 2 mugs of tea. She had sat across from Becca at the kitchen table and she had said, "Tell me about the program." That was all. No argument, no current, no gentle redirection toward something manageable and local. Just, "Tell me about the program." Becca told me that part twice, slowly, like she was still processing that it had happened. I did not know what to do with that information. I filed it in the same mental folder where I kept the torn letter and the taped seams and the 11 minutes in the hotel bathroom. The folder was thick. I left it open for the first time. What I was not prepared for came 4 months later, the week before Becca left for Evanston. A letter arrived at my Cambridge apartment in a plain white envelope with a Cumberland postmark and no return address. The handwriting on the front was my mother's, the same handwriting that had been on the pharmacy prescription labels she organized in the medicine cabinet every Sunday night for as long as I could remember, precise and small and slightly right-leaning. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. No letterhead. No date. 14 lines in the same handwriting. The letter said that she had not known how to say what she was about to say in person, and that she had tried twice and not been able to find the beginning of it. It said she was not writing to ask for anything. It said she understood what I had done for Becca and why I had done it in front of people, and that she was not going to pretend she hadn't understood it in the moment even if her response had not shown that she had. It said there were things she had believed about how a life was supposed to be built that she had never examined, because examining them would have required her to look at the years she had already spent inside them, and that she had chosen not to, and that she knew that was a choice. It said she had found the taped copy of my MIT letter in Becca's room the week before and had held it for a long time. The last 2 lines said, "I don't know if you can hear this from me. I'm saying it in case you can. I'm sorry I tore it." I read the letter 4 times standing at the kitchen counter. The kettle was on and I forgot about it and it boiled dry. I folded the letter back into thirds. I sat down at the desk. The framed MIT letter was above me on the wall, the tape lines browning steadily the way tape does when it has been holding something together for long enough that the holding becomes its permanent condition. I looked at it for a while. Then I took out a piece of paper and I wrote back. My letter was shorter than hers. 9 lines. I said I had heard her. I said I didn't have a clean answer yet about what hearing her meant or where it led, and that I was not going to offer one before I had it. I said Becca was going to be extraordinary and that I thought she already knew that. I said I was glad she sat back down with the tea. I signed it with my first name. Becca left for Evanston on a Thursday in August in a rented minivan with 2 duffel bags, a second-hand desk lamp, and a box of books that was heavier than everything else combined. Our father drove her. Our mother stood on the tilted front porch of the duplex on Mechanic Street and watched the minivan back out. Becca told me later that when the van reached the end of the block and she turned to look through the rear window, our mother was still standing on the porch with her hand raised, not waving exactly, just raised the way you hold your hand up when you are holding something you are not yet ready to put down. Becca said she raised her hand back. The van turned the corner. She faced forward. She did not cry until they hit the interstate, and then she cried for exactly 1 exit, and then she stopped and looked out the window at the flat January-colored farmland of western Maryland opening out on both sides of the highway, and she felt, she told me, like something in her chest had been unclenched for the first time in years. I kept the letter from my mother in the same shoebox where I kept Becca's 23 letters from our undergraduate years. It sits on the top shelf of my current apartment in Cambridge, a 2-bedroom now, no roommate, a window above the desk that faces east. The framed MIT letter is still on the wall. The tape is darker now than it was. The scholarship sentence is still legible. I look at it every morning before I begin work the same way I have looked at it every morning since Priya handed me the frame on Albany Street. What I see when I look at it is not the tearing, which was 7 seconds. I see the taping, which was one night in a bathroom at 1 in the morning with a roll of clear tape, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that what has been broken is also what will carry them. The letter held. That is the whole story. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.